The first shovel of earth came up dark and heavy on the morning of May 3rd, 1886, while the rest of Copper Ridge was still sleeping off Saturday night's whiskey. Margaret Vance stood in her backyard with a surveyor's map spread across a wooden crate. Her daughter Alice holding down the corners against the wind that never stopped blowing across the Montana Plateau. Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if the story is touching you already, make sure you're subscribed. I've got something extra special saved for tomorrow. The map showed 3 lines, each one precisely measured and marked. House to bakery, 43 feet. Bakery to storage shed, 28 feet. Storage shed to livestock shelter, 31 feet. A total of 102 feet of underground passage that Margaret intended to dig herself, by hand, through soil that hadn't been broken since the glaciers retreated 10,000 years ago. Her neighbors called it madness. They called it worse than that when they'd had enough beer at Murphy's saloon. The widow Vance, they said, had finally cracked under the weight of running a business alone. First, she insisted on keeping the bakery open after Thomas died. Then she refused every marriage proposal from men who could have made her life easier. Now she was digging holes in the ground like some kind of animal, talking about winter storms that might never come. Margaret was 41 years old. Her hands were scarred from years of kneading dough and stoking ovens. Her back ached most mornings from lifting flour sacks and hauling water. Her daughter Alice was 16, strong and capable, but too young to carry the weight Margaret had been carrying for 3 years since Thomas's heart gave out on a July afternoon, so hot the bread wouldn't rise properly. She had been alone ever since. Not lonely. She had Alice, and she had her work, and she had customers who depended on her bread every morning. But alone in a way that mattered on the frontier, where survival depended on strength and stubbornness and the willingness to do whatever needed doing, even when everyone told you it was impossible. The bakery sat at the heart of her small property, a sturdy log structure with a stone chimney that Thomas had built with his own hands. The storage shed stood to the east, where she kept flour and sugar and the other supplies that sustained her business through the long winters when freight wagons couldn't make it up from Helena. The livestock shelter hunched to the north, housing the milk cow, the laying hens, and the 2 goats that provided backup when the cow went dry. Between these buildings lay open ground, 43 feet from house to bakery, 28 feet from bakery to storage, 31 feet from storage to shelter, distances that seemed trivial in summer, when the sun stayed up past 9 o'clock and the wind was warm and the grass grew thick enough to cushion each step. But Margaret remembered last winter. She remembered the morning in January when the temperature dropped to 48 below zero and the wind came screaming down from Canada, with nothing to stop it but a few scattered buildings and the stubborn people who refused to abandon them. She remembered trying to reach the bakery at 4 in the morning to start the day's bread, making it 10 feet from her back door before the cold drove her back inside, gasping and shaking, her lungs burning from air too cold to breathe. She had lost that day's baking. More importantly, she had nearly lost her fingers to frostbite. The bakery had stayed dark and cold, and by the time she could safely reach it the next afternoon, 3 days' worth of risen dough had frozen solid in the proving baskets. Her customers had gone without bread. The miners who depended on her loaves for their lunch pails had complained to anyone who would listen. 2 families had started making their own bread rather than risk another day without. Margaret had lost business she couldn't afford to lose, all because of 43 feet of open ground and wind that could kill in minutes. Thomas had always said that the problem with most people was they only prepared for the last disaster, never the next one. He had survived 15 Montana winters before his heart failed, and every one of them had taught him something. He had kept journals filled with observations about weather patterns, about wind direction and snow accumulation, about the particular ways cold could kill you if you didn't respect it. Margaret had those journals now. She read them every night by lamplight while Alice slept in the room they shared to conserve heat. Thomas had written about the winter of 1871, when temperatures stayed below zero for 6 consecutive weeks. He had written about neighbors who died trying to reach their livestock, about children who wandered from schoolhouses and were found frozen in drifts just yards from safety. He had written, in careful script that showed how seriously he took the observation, about the fundamental problem of frontier architecture. Everyone built separate buildings, house, barn, storage, workshop, because that's how it had always been done. But separation created exposure. Exposure created risk. And risk, given enough time and bad enough weather, created death. The solution, he had written in an entry dated February 1882, would be to eliminate the exposure entirely, connect the buildings underground where the wind can't reach. Let the earth itself provide shelter. He had sketched rough diagrams in the margins. Tunnel systems. He called them passages that would allow movement between critical structures without ever stepping into the killing cold above. He had never built them. There had always been something more urgent, something more immediately necessary. Repairs to make, firewood to split, a business to run and a daughter to raise and a wife who depended on him to keep them all safe and fed. Now he was gone. And Margaret was digging the tunnels he had dreamed about. The work was brutal in ways that surprised her, even though she had prepared herself for difficulty. The soil looked soft on the surface, dark and rich, the kind of earth that should yield easily to a spade. But 2 inches down, it turned hard as brick, compacted by decades of freeze and thaw, laced with rocks that ranged from pebble-sized nuisances to boulders that required pry bar and an hour's work to move. She started with the house-to-bakery passage because that was the one she needed most urgently. Every morning, winter or summer, she had to reach the bakery by 4 o'clock to start the ovens and mix the first batch of dough. In winter, that meant walking 43 feet in total darkness. In cold that could drop below zero even in October, carrying supplies and hoping she didn't slip on ice or lose her way in a sudden wideout. The tunnel would change everything. Once it was finished, she could move between house and bakery in warmth and safety, protected by 6 feet of earth and a roof strong enough to support whatever snow accumulated above. She dug in the early mornings before the bakery opened and again in the late evenings after the day's bread was sold and the ovens banged for the night. Alice helped when she could, though Margaret tried to spare her daughter the hardest labor. Alice had her own work, tending the animals, managing the household, helping with the baking when customers came faster than Margaret could serve them alone. But some evenings after dinner, they would both go out with shovels and work side by side in the growing trench, not talking much, just digging, moving earth one shovelful at a time while the sun set behind the mountains and the evening star appeared above the ridgeline. The neighbors watched from a distance. Some offered help in a mocking tone to people who wanted to say, "I told you so," when the project failed. Others simply shook their heads and went about their business, filing the Widow's Tunnel project in the same category as all the other inexplicable things people did when grief took their common sense. Jacob Murphy, who owned the saloon and considered himself an authority on everything because he heard everyone's business, stopped by one evening in June. He stood at the edge of the trench, which now ran about 15 feet from the house foundation, and watched Margaret dig for a full minute before speaking. "You're wasting your time, Maggie," he said, using the nickname she'd never given him permission to use. "It's 40 feet, not 40 miles. A healthy woman can walk that in 10 seconds. Margaret didn't stop digging. In good weather, in any weather, I've done it in storms you wouldn't believe. Then you've been lucky." She lifted another shovelful of earth and tossed it onto the growing pile beside the trench. "Luck runs out. This is foolish. Everyone says so. Everyone said Thomas was foolish for building with logs instead of sod. Everyone said I was foolish for keeping the bakery instead of selling. Everyone's been wrong before." Murphy spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "Suit yourself. But don't come crying when this collapses on your head, or floods come spring. There's reasons people don't dig tunnels, Maggie. Good reasons." He walked away without offering to help. Margaret kept digging. By late July, the first passage was half complete. 20 feet of trench, 6 feet deep and 4 feet wide, with vertical support posts every 6 feet and horizontal bracing to prevent cave-ins. The work had taken every spare hour she had, and her hands were blistered despite the gloves she wore, her shoulders aching from the repetitive motion of lifting and throwing earth. But it was working. The trench was stable. The supports held. When she stood at the bottom and looked up at the rectangle of sky above, she could see the shape of what it would become, a passage carved from the earth itself, a refuge from the wind that never stopped blowing. Alice brought her water one evening while she worked. Her daughter was quiet, watching her with a serious expression she'd inherited from Thomas, the look that meant she was thinking about something important but hadn't decided whether to speak. "Mother," she finally said, "do you really think the tunnels will make a difference?" Margaret paused, her shovel balanced against the trench wall. "Yes. The others say you're crazy. They say even Father wouldn't have done something like this. Your father planned these tunnels. He just didn't live long enough to dig them." Margaret pointed at the support posts with her shovel. "See how these are spaced? That's from his journals. He calculated the load-bearing requirements, the drainage angles, everything. I'm just following his design." Alice looked at the trench, then back at her mother. "What if they're right? What if this is too much for us?" "It probably is," Margaret admitted. "Most things worth doing are too much. We do them anyway." Her daughter considered this, then nodded slowly. "I brought your coat. It's getting cold." The temperature had indeed dropped as the sun set. Margaret climbed out of the trench and accepted the coat, pulling it on over her work dress. August in Montana, and already the evenings carried the promise of winter. The aspens on the mountainside were just beginning to turn gold at their highest reaches. In 6 weeks, maybe 8, the first snow would fall. She needed the first tunnel finished before then, preferably all 3, but at minimum the house-to-bakery passage had to be functional before winter arrived in earnest. Everything else was secondary to that single goal. The roofing came next, and it proved even more difficult than the digging. Margaret needed planks strong enough to support 18 inches of earth, plus whatever snow would accumulate above. Thomas's journal specified 3-inch boards laid at 12-inch intervals, but lumber that thick was expensive and had to be freighted up from Helena at considerable cost. She sold her wedding ring to pay for it, the gold band Thomas had placed on her finger 17 years ago, at a ceremony in a Helena church with her parents watching and a future that seemed full of possibilities stretching ahead. She hadn't worn it since he died. It reminded her too much of everything she'd lost, but she'd kept it in a wooden box on the shelf above her bed, thinking someday Alice might want it. Alice told her not to sell it, said there had to be another way. But there was another way. Not really. Not if Margaret wanted the lumber she needed at a price she could afford. The jeweler in Helena gave her $40 for the ring, which was exactly enough for the boards plus the tar paper she needed for waterproofing. She didn't regret it. Thomas would have approved. He had always valued safety over sentiment, preparation over nostalgia. "The dead don't need gold," he used to say. "The living need walls." By September, the first tunnel was complete. Margaret stood in her root cellar, where the passage began with a trap door set into the floor, and felt something like triumph mixed with exhaustion. The door was solid pine, fitted with rope hinges that wouldn't freeze in winter, and a latch that could be opened even with mittened hands. She descended the ladder into darkness, carrying a lantern that cast dancing shadows on the earthen walls. The passage stretched ahead, straight and level, the support posts standing at perfect 6-foot intervals, the roof boards overhead solid and dry despite the rain that had fallen the night before. The drainage system she'd installed, a gradual slope toward a gravel-filled sump at the bakery end, had done its job perfectly. The air underground was cool, but not cold, steady in a way surface air never was. The wind that constantly scoured the plateau above couldn't reach here. The temperature fluctuations that made Montana, weather so unpredictable, had no power in this space carved from the earth itself. Margaret walked a full 43 feet, her boots echoing on the packed dirt floor, and emerged in the feed room of her bakery through another trap door identical to the first. The journey had taken less than 2 minutes. She hadn't felt wind once, hadn't been exposed to cold or snow or the killing weather that turned short distances into death sentences. It worked. It actually worked. Alice was waiting in the bakery when Margaret climbed up. Her daughter's face showed relief and something else. Pride, maybe, or vindication. The townspeople had mocked them both for months. Every time Alice went to the general store, she heard the jokes. Every time she passed men gathered outside Murphy's saloon, she heard them laughing about her crazy mother who thought she could dig like a badger. "How is it?" Alice asked. "Perfect," Margaret said. "Exactly like your father designed it." They stood together in the pre-dawn darkness of the bakery, the ovens cold and waiting, The day's work not yet begun. Outside, the wind was picking up, carrying the scent of snow from the high peaks. September snow, which meant winter was coming early. Margaret had 2 more tunnels to dig. Bakery to storage shed to livestock shelter. 59 more feet of passage through earth that got harder to move as autumn progressed and the ground began its long freeze. She started the 2nd tunnel the next morning. End of part 1. Sections 1 to 3. 3,450 words. Margaret has been introduced in her isolation after her husband's death, running a business alone in a harsh frontier town. The catalyst, her decision to dig 3 tunnels based on her late husband's journals, has been established against community mockery. The first tunnel is complete, proving the concept works, but 2 more remain before winter arrives. The 2nd tunnel began in the corner of the bakery storage room, where 50-pound sacks of flour stood stacked against the wall like white soldiers. Margaret marked the entry point with chalk, then started removing floorboards to expose the earth beneath. This passage would be shorter than the first, only 28 feet, but more complicated. The storage shed sat at a slightly lower elevation than the bakery, which meant the tunnel would need a more pronounced drainage slope. Water couldn't be allowed to pool in a space where flour and sugar were stored. One flood could destroy her entire winter inventory and put her out of business permanently. October arrived with frost that whitened the grass each morning and didn't fully melt until noon. The ground was hardening, fighting her shovel with every bite. Margaret's progress slowed to 6 feet per day, then 5, then 4. Her hands developed new calluses on top of old ones. Her back seized up some mornings, requiring an hour of careful movement before she could straighten fully. But she kept digging. Alice worked beside her now, no longer asking if it was worth the effort. Her daughter had seen the first tunnel prove itself during a cold snap in late September, when the temperature dropped to 15 below and stayed there for 3 days. Margaret had made her daily trips to the bakery without coat or gloves, walking the underground passage in nothing but her work dress, protected by earth and timber from the wind that was giving everyone else in town frostbite, just walking from house to outhouse. The customers had noticed. More importantly, the customers had started talking. Sarah Chun, who ran the boarding house, stopped by the bakery one morning in early October. She waited until the other customers had left, then approached the counter where Margaret was wrapping loaves in brown paper. "I want to see it," Sarah said without preamble. "The tunnel." Margaret looked up, surprised. Sarah was practical to the point of bluntness, a Chinese immigrant who had survived prejudice and isolation that made Margaret's struggles look trivial by comparison. If Sarah was interested in the tunnels, it meant she saw utility, not madness. "Why?" "Because I watched you walk to your bakery yesterday morning, when it was 20 below. You weren't even wearing a coat." Sarah leaned against the counter. "I have 6 boarders who need feeding every morning. My kitchen is 40 feet from my dining room, separate building, because that's how the fool who built this place designed it. Last winter, I lost 3 toes to frostbite, making that walk twice a day. This winter, I'd like to keep the rest." Margaret wiped flour, dust from her hands. "Come on, then." She led Sarah through the bakery to the storage room, opened the trap door in the floor, and descended the ladder. Sarah followed, her practical boots finding each rung with the certainty of someone who had spent her life working with her hands in difficult places. They walked the tunnel together, Sarah's eyes taking in every detail: the support posts and their spacing, the roof boards and their thickness, the drainage slope and the gravel sump at the far end, the tar paper waterproofing that kept moisture from seeping through. When they emerged in Margaret's root cellar, Sarah stood silent for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then she said, "How much?" "How much what?" "How much would you charge to build one for me? I have money saved. Not much, but enough for materials if you'd agree to do the labor." Margaret hadn't considered this possibility. The tunnels were her project, her solution to her specific problem, based on her husband's designs and her own desperate need. The idea that someone else might want the same protection had never occurred to her. "I don't know," she admitted. "I've never built for anyone else." "Think about it," Sarah said. "I'm not the only one who's noticed what you're doing. People are starting to talk. Not everyone's laughing anymore. The conversation stayed with Margaret as she returned to digging the second tunnel. The idea that her work might have value beyond her own survival, that the tunnels Thomas had designed might help others endure what the frontier demanded, felt both exciting and terrifying. She mentioned it to Alice that evening over a dinner of bread and bean soup, the kind of simple meal that sustained them through the busy weeks when baking took precedence over elaborate cooking. "Mrs. Chin wants me to build her a tunnel," Margaret said, tearing off a piece of bread to soak in her soup, "between her kitchen and dining room." Alice looked up, spoon halfway to her mouth. "Are you going to do it?" "I don't know. We barely have time to finish our own tunnels before winter. Taking on another project would bring in money we need," Alice finished. "Mother, the lumber for the third tunnel is going to cost at least $30. We don't have $30. We'll manage." "How?" "We're barely covering expenses as it is." Alice set down her spoon with more force than necessary. "Father's been gone 3 years. The bakery keeps us fed, but there's nothing extra. Nothing for repairs, nothing for emergencies, nothing for—" "I know." Margaret did know. She lived with the arithmetic of survival every day, the constant calculation of income versus expenses, of what could be delayed and what couldn't, of which bills to pay first and which creditors would wait another month. But taking on another project means stopping work on our own tunnels. We need all 3 finished before the hard weather comes. Then charge her enough to make it worthwhile. Charge her what the work is actually worth, not what you think a woman should ask for. The comment stung because it was true. Margaret spent her life undervaluing her own labor, asking less than men charged for comparable work, afraid that demanding fair payment would cost her customers she couldn't afford to lose. Thomas had always charged what the work was worth. She charged what she thought people might be willing to pay. "I'll think about it," she said. By mid-October, the second tunnel was 2/3 complete. The passage ran straight and true from the bakery storage room toward the supply shed, the support structure solid despite the increasingly frozen ground. Margaret worked with a pickaxe, now more than a shovel, breaking through soil that had turned to something approaching stone. Other people had started coming around, not to mock, but to watch, to ask questions, to understand how a widow with no engineering training had managed to build something that seemed to work better than anyone had predicted. John Whitmore, the livery owner, spent an entire afternoon examining the first tunnel, measuring the post spacing and the board thickness, asking about drainage and ventilation, and load calculations. He had 3 buildings on his property that needed connecting: stable, feed storage, and tack room, and winters that regularly killed horses when he couldn't reach them in time during the worst storms. "I could pay," he said when he finished his inspection. "Not cash, but labor. I've got 2 strong sons and access to timber. We could help you finish your third tunnel if you'd agree to design one for us." Margaret considered this. 2 extra workers would cut her construction time in half. She could have all 3 tunnels finished before November, before the serious cold arrived, before she had to work in conditions that made digging nearly impossible. "Your boys know how to follow instructions?" she asked. "They've built half the barns in this county. They know their way around timber and tools." "Then we have a deal. But I design it and I supervise. My husband's specifications, not yours." Whitmore extended his hand. "Fair enough." The partnership changed everything. Whitmore's sons, James and Robert, arrived the next morning with tools and energy that Margaret had forgotten men their age possessed. They were 19 and 21, farm-raised and work-hardened, capable of moving earth at twice the speed Margaret could manage alone. With their help, the second tunnel was completed in 5 days. The third tunnel, from supply shed to livestock shelter, took another week. By early November, Margaret's entire property was connected by underground passages that allowed movement between every critical building without exposure to the weather above. She tested the system on a morning when the thermometer read 12 below zero, and the wind was howling down from Canada with enough force to rattle the windows in their frames. She started in her root cellar, descended into the first tunnel, walked to the bakery in calm air that felt almost warm by comparison to the killing cold above. From there, she moved through the second tunnel to the supply shed, loaded her arms with flour and sugar, and continued to the third tunnel to the livestock shelter. The milk cow looked at her with mild surprise, as if wondering why any human would venture out in such weather. Margaret fed and watered the animals, collected eggs from the laying hens, and returned the way she had come, arriving back in her kitchen 15 minutes later, without ever stepping outside. Alice was waiting with hot coffee. How was it? Perfect. Margaret wrapped her hands around the cup, savoring warmth that had nothing to do with the coffee. Every passage held. The drainage worked. The temperature underground stayed above, freezing even when the surface was 12 below. It's exactly what your father designed it to be. He'd be proud, Alice said quietly. He'd be relieved. He spent 15 years worrying about how we'd survive without him. Now we know. Section 5. The Deeper Secret, Second Layer Revelation. News of Margaret's tunnel system spread through Copper Ridge with the speed of all truly useful information. By mid-November, she had 5 requests for similar construction projects. The doctor wanted his house connected to his clinic. The school teacher wanted the schoolhouse connected to the coal shed. 3 families with livestock wanted passages built before winter settled in completely. Margaret couldn't take all the work. She could barely manage her own bakery and the one project she committed to, John Whitmore's stable complex. But the demand revealed something she hadn't anticipated. Thomas's tunnel designs had value far beyond their utility to a single widow struggling to keep her business running. They represented a solution to one of the frontier's fundamental problems: how to survive winters that regularly killed people who were doing nothing more dangerous than walking between buildings on their own property. She began teaching others how to build according to Thomas's specifications: the post spacing that prevented collapses, the drainage angles that prevented flooding, the roof structure that could support snow loads without sagging, the waterproofing techniques that kept passages dry through freeze-thaw cycles. Sarah Chun was her first student, learning the principles so she could build her own tunnel with hired help rather than depending on Margaret's limited time. John Whitmore's sons became her second and third students, absorbing the engineering concepts that turned Thomas's rough journal sketches into functional structures. The teaching felt strange at first. Margaret had never thought of herself as someone who had knowledge worth sharing. She was just a baker, a widow, a woman doing whatever it took to survive. But watching others learn from what Thomas had figured out, seeing them apply principles he had died before implementing, made her realize that his journals contained more than personal observations. They contained a methodology, a system, a body of practical knowledge that could save lives if people understood and applied it correctly. By December, 6 tunnel systems were under construction in Copper Ridge and the surrounding homesteads. Margaret supervised when she could, troubleshot problems when they arose, and slowly began charging for her expertise in a way that would have made Thomas proud. She wasn't getting rich, but for the first time in 3 years, she wasn't constantly calculating which bills could wait another month. The bakery covered their basic expenses. The tunnel consultation work provided margin for emergencies and repairs, and the occasional luxury, like coffee that didn't taste like roasted dirt. Alice noticed the change. "You're different," she said one evening while they worked together preparing the next day's dough. "Different how?" "You're not afraid anymore. Not the way you were after Father died." Margaret considered this, her hands working the dough with the automatic precision of long practice. "I'm still afraid, but it's a different kind of fear. Not the fear of failing, just the fear of what comes next." "What has come next?" "I don't know yet, but I'll figure it out. That's what the tunnels taught me. You don't have to know everything before you start. You just have to start." The real test came in January, exactly 1 year after Margaret had started digging. The weather turned with the sudden violence that characterized Montana winters, temperatures dropping from 20 above to 30 below in the space of 6 hours. The wind came screaming down from Canada, driving snow so thick that visibility dropped to nothing. The storm lasted 4 days. During those 4 days, Margaret made her regular trips to the bakery through the underground passages, maintaining her business schedule as if the apocalypse above ground wasn't happening. She fed her livestock twice daily. She monitored her supplies. She kept her ovens running and her bread production steady. Her customers couldn't reach her, but that didn't matter. When the storm broke and people emerged from their homes to assess the damage, they found Margaret's bakery open and operating, fresh bread cooling on the racks, as if nothing unusual had occurred. The contrast with the rest of town was stark. Murphy's saloon had lost half its roof to wind damage. The general store had gone 4 days without fresh supplies because the owner couldn't reach his storage building. 2 families had lost livestock because they couldn't care for animals housed in separate structures. Old Samuel Peterson, a Norwegian homesteader who had been in the territory since 1870, had tried to reach his barn on the second day of the storm. His son found him 3 hours later, frozen to death 40 feet from his own front door, turned around by wind and blowing snow until he didn't know which direction led to safety. The death hit the community hard. Peterson had survived 15 brutal winters. He knew cold. He knew storms. He had laughed at Margaret's tunnels like everyone else, secure in the knowledge that he had endured worse and would endure worse again. He had been wrong. The storm had killed him, the same storm that Margaret had weathered without even putting on a coat. The funeral was held on a bitter, clear day when the temperature never rose above 0. The entire town attended, standing in the cemetery while the preacher spoke about mortality and the harsh demands of frontier life, and the mysterious ways of Providence that took the experienced and spared the foolhardy. Margaret stood at the back of the crowd with Alice beside her. She didn't feel vindicated. She felt sad. Peterson's death was preventable. If he'd had a tunnel, if he'd understood the principles Thomas had spent 15 years developing, if he'd been willing to do the difficult work of preparation rather than trusting his experience and his courage, he'd still be alive. After the service, people approached her, not to apologize for mocking her, though some did that too. Mostly they came to ask for help. They wanted tunnels. They wanted to learn what Thomas had known. They wanted the protection that Peterson hadn't had. Margaret listened to them all. She took names and properties and made rough calculations about what each project would require. By the time the cemetery emptied, she had commitments for 14 new tunnel systems, more work than she could possibly complete before next winter arrived. That evening, she sat at her kitchen table with Alice and spread out Thomas's journals. Her daughter had brought her coffee and was now sitting across from her, watching with a patient expression that meant she was waiting for her mother to reach whatever conclusion was forming. "I can't build 14 tunnel systems," Margaret said. "Even with help. Even working through spring and summer and into fall. It's too much. So tell some of them no. They're the same people who mocked me 6 months ago. Part of me wants to let them freeze. Let them understand what refusing help costs." Margaret traced her finger along one of Thomas's sketches. But Peterson's death wasn't his fault. Not really. He was just doing what everyone told him was right. Trust your experience. Be tough. Don't waste time on elaborate preparations. The frontier values that approach. It rewards it right up until the moment it kills you. So what do you want to do? Margaret looked at the journals, at Thomas's careful handwriting and precise drawings, at 15 years of accumulated knowledge that had died with him because he'd never found a way to share it beyond his own family. "I want to write it down," she said. "All of it. The measurements and the angles and the drainage specifications. The post spacing and the board thickness and the waterproofing techniques. Everything Tom has figured out. I want to put it in a form that anyone can follow, so they don't need me standing over their shoulder telling them every step. A manual," Alice said. "You want to write a construction manual?" "Yes. And then I want to teach people how to build from it. Not do the building for them, but show them how to do it themselves. That way 14 becomes 40. 40 becomes 100. Everyone who needs protection gets it, whether I'm available to help or not." Alice smiled. Father would have liked that. Father never thought that far ahead. He was always too busy solving the immediate problem. Margaret closed the journal carefully. "But he gave me the foundation. The rest is just building on what he started." Section 6. The threat escalates external pressure. The manual took 3 weeks to write. Margaret worked on it late at night after the bacon was done and the day's business concluded, her hand cramping from the unfamiliar work of forming words instead of shaping dough. Alice helped. translating Thomas's technical observations into language that non-engineers could understand, drawing diagrams that clarified what text couldn't adequately convey. The result was 32 pages of precise instructions for building underground passages that could withstand Montana winters, load calculations and drainage specifications, material lists and tool requirements, step-by-step procedures that assume no prior construction experience beyond basic carpentry. Margaret had 50 copies printed at the newspaper office in Helena, paying for it with money from her tunnel consultation work. The printer, a man named Davies who had seen enough frontier deaths to appreciate practical safety measures, charged her cost plus 10% and threw in a leather binding for the original manuscript. "This is good work," he said, handing her the first completed copy. "Practical, clear, the kind of thing that saves lives if people actually use it. That's the question, isn't it?" Margaret thumbed through the pages, checking that everything had printed correctly. Whether people will use it. They will. Peterson's death scared folks, made them realize that experience and toughness aren't always enough. You're offering them a solution that doesn't require them to admit they were wrong or foolish. That matters more than you think. The manual was sold for 50 cents each, which was less than the printing cost, but more than nothing. Margaret wasn't trying to profit from Thomas's knowledge. She was trying to ensure that enough people had access to it, that tunnel building would become standard practice rather than an eccentricity of one grief-maddened widow. The first 10 copies sold in 2 days. The next 20 sold by the end of the week. Requests came from homesteaders as far away as Bozeman and Billings. The regional newspaper ran a story about the tunnel manual that was changing how people thought about winter safety on the high plains. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more incredible mountain stories like this one. The success should have felt satisfying. Margaret had accomplished something meaningful, had taken Thomas's private observations and transformed them into public knowledge that could help people survive conditions that regularly killed them. She should have felt proud. Instead, she felt increasingly uneasy. The trouble started with Jacob Murphy. He appeared at the bakery on a gray February morning, his expression carrying particular hostility of men who see others succeeding in ways they can't control. "I hear you're making money off this tunnel business," he said, loud enough for the other customers to hear. "Teaching people and selling manuals and charging for supervision." "I'm covering costs," Margaret replied, wrapping a loaf for Mrs. Henderson, who was trying very hard to appear uninvolved in the conversation. "The manual sells for less than it costs to print, but you're charging for the teaching, charging for consultation, making yourself out to be some kind of expert when all you did was dig a few holes in the ground. Holes that kept me alive during the storm that killed Samuel Peterson." Margaret handed Mrs. Henderson her wrapped loaf and accepted payment, counting coins with deliberate calm. "Is there something specific you need, Mr. Murphy, or are you just here to complain about success that doesn't include you?" Murphy's face reddened. "I'm here to remind you that some of us have been in this territory longer than you have. Some of us understand how things work. And we don't appreciate outsiders coming in and pretending they invented solutions to problems we've all been handling just fine for decades. Peterson wasn't handling things fine. He's dead. Peterson was old and unlucky. Could have happened to anyone. It happened to him because he didn't have proper protection. The tunnels provide that protection. If you have a better solution, I'd be happy to hear it." Murphy leaned across the counter, his breath carrying the sour smell of morning whiskey. "My solution is that women should stick to women's work. Baking bread, raising children, leaving the building and the planning to men who know what they're doing." The bakery had gone quiet. Every customer was watching now, waiting to see how Margaret would respond. Alice had emerged from the back room, her hand resting on the handle of the fire poker they kept near the oven. Margaret held Murphy's gaze, her voice level and cold. "Get out of my bakery." "Or what?" "Or I'll have the sheriff remove you for threatening a business owner. Your choice." Murphy straightened, sneering. "You think you're something special now. You think digging holes makes you important. But winter's almost over, and next year people will forget all about your tunnels and your fancy manual. Things will go back to the way they're supposed to be. Women in kitchens, men making decisions, the natural order. He left, but his words lingered like smoke after a fire. The other customers departed quickly, uncomfortable with the confrontation they'd witnessed. Only Alice remained, still holding the fire poker. "He's an angry drunk," Alice said. "Everyone knows it. Don't let him bother you." "I'm not bothered by him. I'm bothered by what he represents." Margaret began cleaning the counter with unnecessary force. "There are men in this town who will never forgive me for being right when they were wrong, who will spend the rest of their lives trying to diminish what we've accomplished because it threatens their sense of how the world should work. Then let them try. You have the manual. You have students. You have proof that the tunnels work. What can they really do?" Margaret wished she had an answer, but Murphy's visit had unsettled her in ways she couldn't fully articulate. It wasn't his threats that worried her. It was the realization that success brought opposition, that solving problems sometimes created new enemies, that choosing to be visible and effective meant accepting vulnerability in ways invisibility had never demanded. The next threat came from a different direction. A man named Harrison Blackwell arrived in Copper Ridge in early March, claiming to represent a Helena-based construction firm that specialized in frontier infrastructure. He was smooth and educated, with the kind of polished manners that marked him as an Easterner trying to make his fortune in the West. He visited Margaret at the bakery, waiting until the morning rush had ended before approaching the counter with an offer he clearly expected her to accept gratefully. "Mrs. Vance, I've heard impressive things about your tunnel system. My firm would like to purchase the rights to your construction manual and hire you as a consultant on a series of projects throughout the territory." Margaret studied him, sensing something beneath the professional courtesy. "Purchase the rights? The manual is already in print. Anyone can buy it for 50 cents. Exactly the problem. You're underselling valuable intellectual property. My firm can print and distribute the manual properly, charge what it's actually worth, and provide you with percentage of the proceeds. We're talking about real money, Mrs. Vance. Enough to secure your daughter's future. Enough to retire from baking if you choose. And what would you charge the manual? $5 per copy. Perhaps more, depending on the market. $5 for information that could save someone's life during a storm. Information has value, Mrs. Vance. Why shouldn't you profit from the work you've done?" Margaret felt her earlier unease solidifying into something clearer. "Because my husband spent 15 years figuring out these principles, and he died before he could implement them. Because Samuel Peterson died in a storm, he could have survived if he'd had access to this knowledge. Because people are dying from preventable exposure, and charging them $5 for the solution is just another way of selecting who deserves to survive based on who can afford protection." Blackwell's professional smile didn't waver. "That's a very noble sentiment. But nobility doesn't pay bills. From what I understand, you're barely covering expenses. This offer could change that. I'm not interested. Perhaps you should take some time to consider." "I said I'm not interested. The manual stays as it is. 50 cents to cover printing costs. Available to anyone who needs it. Thank you for your visit, Mr. Blackwell." He left, but not before delivering a parting comment that felt more like a warning. "It's a competitive market, Mrs. Vance. Other people are already copying your designs, building their own tunnel systems and charging for work. If you won't protect your intellectual property, others will simply take it and profit from your labor without giving you anything in return." That night, Margaret sat at her kitchen table with Alice and admitted what had been growing increasingly obvious. "We've created something that works. That means other people want to control it. Can they?" Alice asked. "Can Murphy or Blackwell or anyone else actually stop you?" "They can't stop the knowledge from spreading. The manual exists. People have copies. The tunnels are being built. But they can make my life difficult. They can challenge my authority. They can undermine my reputation or start competing businesses or find a dozen other ways to turn success into a problem. So what do? I keep going. I teach everyone who wants to learn. I help everyone who asks for help I make the knowledge so widespread that no one person or company can claim ownership of it. Margaret opened Thomas's journal to a passage she'd read 100 times. Your father wrote that the frontier values individual achievement, but survival depends on shared knowledge. I'm choosing the survival option, even if it means you never get rich from this. I watched your father work himself into an early grave, try and provide for us. I won't do the same thing chasing money I don't need. We have enough. That's more than most people can say. Alice reached across the table and squeezed her mother's hand. Father would be proud, not because you're successful, but because you're doing it right. Margaret squeezed back. I hope so, because next winter is going to be the real test. Not whether the tunnels work. We know they work. But whether enough people build them in time. Whether enough people are willing to do the difficult work of preparation before the crisis arrives. Outside, the wind was picking up, carrying the last cold breath of winter across the plateau. In 6 weeks, the ground would thaw. In 7 weeks, construction season would begin in earnest. Margaret had orders for 43 tunnel systems, each one representing a family that had decided preparation was worth the effort. 43 families who might live through next winter, because Thomas had been thoughtful enough to write down what he learned, and Margaret had been stubborn enough to dig what everyone said was impossible. The tunnels had worked. Now she had to make sure they multiplied. Spring came late to Copper Ridge that year. Snow lingered in the shaded draws well into April, and the ground stayed frozen hard enough to resist shovels until May. But when construction season finally arrived, the work began with an intensity Margaret had never witnessed. 43 tunnel projects started simultaneously. Homesteaders who had bought the manual work from Thomas's specifications, measuring and marking, and digging according to principles that Margaret had made freely available. Those who needed help got it, not from Margaret alone, but from the network of students she had trained through the winter. John Whitmore's sons had become expert tunnel builders, capable of supervising projects without Margaret's direct oversight. Sarah Chun had learned enough to troubleshoot drainage problems and support structure failures. Even Alice had developed skills that made her valuable as a consultant, able to read Thomas's technical drawings and translate them into practical instruction. The community was building, not under Margaret's control, but from her teaching. The knowledge Thomas had accumulated was spreading exactly the way Margaret had hoped, becoming common practice rather than proprietary technique, available to anyone willing to do the work. But not everyone was willing to let it happen peacefully. Jacob Murphy spent the spring spreading rumors. He told anyone who would listen that Margaret's tunnels were dangerous, that the support structures were inadequate, that the whole system would collapse during the first serious storm and trap people underground where they would suffocate or drown. He couldn't point to actual failures. There hadn't been any. But he didn't need facts when fear would serve just as well. Harrison Blackwell took a different approach. His construction firm began building tunnels throughout the territory, charging premium prices, and claiming their designs were superior to the amateur efforts documented in Margaret's manual. The tunnels they built were functional, but unnecessarily expensive, requiring materials and techniques that drove costs beyond what most homesteaders could afford. Worse, Blackwell's firm began telling customers that Margaret's manual contained dangerous errors, that following her specifications without professional supervision could result in structural failures and loss of life. They offered expert consultation for $5, exactly the price Margaret had refused to charge for the manual itself. The combination of Murphy's fear-mongering and Blackwell's commercial competition created confusion in a community that had been moving toward consensus. People who had committed to tunnel construction started having doubts. Some postponed projects, deciding to wait another year to see how existing tunnels performed. Others hired Blackwell's firm despite the cost, afraid that cutting corners might prove fatal. Margaret watched the momentum she had built begin to erode. It frustrated her, but it didn't surprise her. Change always met resistance. People who profited from the old ways always fought to preserve them. What surprised her was a town council meeting in late June. Murphy had petitioned for a special session to address what he called public safety concerns regarding unauthorized underground construction. The notice went up at the general store and the post office, formally worded but clearly aimed at Margaret and anyone following her manual. Alice wanted her mother to ignore it. It's just Murphy being spiteful. Everyone knows he's angry because you proved him wrong. Everyone knows, but not everyone believes it matters. Margaret was packing a basket with documents, Thomas's journals, her manual, letters from satisfied customers, structural diagrams. If we don't defend the work publicly, if we let Murphy's lies become the official record, we lose credibility. People who are scared will choose expensive professional help over free community knowledge. Blackwell wins. Murphy wins. And next winter, people die because they couldn't afford proper protection. You really think it's that serious? I think Peterson is dead, and he's not coming back. I think there are 40 families right now building tunnel systems that could save their lives. If Murphy convinces a council to ban or restrict that work, those families go back to risking exposure every time they need to feed livestock or check supplies. Yes, it's that serious. The council meeting was held in the schoolhouse, the only building large enough to accommodate the crowd that showed up. Margaret arrived early with Alice, claiming seats in the front row where council members couldn't avoid seeing them. John Whitmore and his son sat directly behind them. Sarah Chun came with 3 of her boarders, all of the men who had used Margaret's tunnel to reach the dining room every morning through the late winter storms. Murphy arrived with Harrison Blackwell, and a man Margaret didn't recognize, tall and thin, with the self-important bearing of someone accustomed to being listened to. Blackwell introduced him to the council president as Ernest Caldwell, structural engineer from the territorial capital, here to provide expert testimony on underground construction safety. Margaret's stomach tightened. An engineer, Blackwell had brought actual professional credentials to counter her amateur manual. This wasn't going to be a simple matter of defending her work against Murphy's complaints. This was going to be a technical debate she might not be qualified to win. Council President Douglas Mitchell called the meeting to order, his voice carrying the weary authority of a man who had mediated too many disputes between neighbors who couldn't resolve their differences privately. Mr. Murphy has raised concerns about tunnel construction safety. We're here to examine those concerns and determine if town regulation is warranted. Mr. Murphy, you have the floor. Murphy stood, and for once he wasn't drunk. His presentation was coherent, even persuasive. He cited theoretical dangers, collapse risk, flooding potential, inadequate ventilation, fire hazards if people stored flammable materials underground. He pointed out that Margaret had no formal engineering training, no professional certification, no credentials beyond being a baker who had followed her dead husband's amateur sketches. I'm not saying Mrs. Vance meant any harm, he concluded, his tone almost reasonable. I'm saying she's in over her head. Underground construction requires expertise she doesn't have. We need proper regulations, professional oversight, safety inspections. Otherwise, we're gambling with lives. The crowd murmured, some people nodding agreement. Margaret felt Alice tense beside her, but she kept her own expression neutral. Murphy had made a better case than she'd expected. Now came the real threat. Harrison Blackwell stood next. His presentation was smoother, backed by charts and diagrams that looked impressive even if Margaret couldn't immediately evaluate their accuracy. He talked about load calculations and soil compaction coefficients and structural integrity margins. He made it sound like tunnel construction required advanced mathematics and specialized knowledge that only trained professionals possessed. Then he introduced Ernest Caldwell. The engineer approached the front of the room, carrying a leather portfolio. He extracted documents with the careful precision of someone performing for an audience. His voice carried professional authority that made Murphy sound like an angry drunk and Blackwell sound like a salesman. "I've reviewed Mrs. Vance's construction manual," Caldwell said, holding up a copy. "While the intentions are admirable, the technical specifications are inadequate for safe underground construction. The support post spacing is too wide. The drainage calculations don't account for spring runoff. The roof structure lacks sufficient redundancy to prevent catastrophic failure under heavy snow load." He went to the manual page by page, citing deficiencies that sounded damning even though Margaret couldn't immediately identify what was wrong with his analysis. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, more concerned. Even people who had been supportive now looked uncertain. "In my professional opinion," Caldwell concluded, Any tunnel built according to these specifications poses unacceptable risk to occupants and should be considered structurally unsound until professionally inspected and certified. Council President Mitchell looked troubled. Mrs. Vance, do you wish to respond? Margaret stood, her legs steadier than she expected. She walked to front of the room, carrying Thomas's journals, and met Caldwell's gaze directly. Mr. Caldwell, you said the support post spacing in my manual is too wide. What spacing do you recommend? 4 feet on center for primary supports. My manual specifies 6 feet. Can you explain why 4 is necessary when 6 has successfully supported existing tunnels through multiple heavy snow events without failure? Caldwell's expression didn't change. Theoretical calculations indicate 4 feet provides adequate safety margin. Theoretical, meaning you haven't actually built or tested anything. You're working from formulas. Margaret opened Thomas's journal to a page marked with a ribbon. My husband spent 15 years observing actual performance. He documented snow loads, spring runoff volumes, soil compaction rates, and structural behavior under real-world conditions. His specifications aren't theoretical. They're empirical, based on what actually works, not what calculations suggest might work. With all due respect, Mrs. Vance, your husband wasn't a trained engineer. No, he was a miner who spent his working life underground, evaluating tunnel stability in conditions far more demanding than anything we face here. He understood practical engineering in ways classroom training doesn't teach. She turned to address the full crowd. The tunnels built from Thomas's designs have performed perfectly through the worst weather this territory has seen in decades. 0 failures, 0 injuries, 0 deaths among people who used them when Samuel Peterson died because he didn't have that protection. Past performance doesn't guarantee, Caldwell began. It guarantees more than your theoretical calculations. Margaret's voice sharpened. You stand here criticizing specifications that have saved lives while offering nothing but formulas and fear. Where are your test structures? Where are your proven designs? Where are the families who survived because they followed your recommendations instead of mine? The crowd had gone quiet. Caldwell's professional composure was showing cracks. The manual is free, Margaret continued, available to anyone for the cost of printing. Mr. Blackwell's firm charges $5 for a consultation based on your theoretical improvements. That's not safety. That's profit disguised as expertise. That's an unfair characterization. Blackwell started to object. Is it? How much are you paying Mr. Caldwell for his testimony tonight? Blackwell's face reddened. Caldwell said nothing. Margaret turned back to the council. You have a choice to make. You can regulate tunnel construction, require expensive inspections and professional certifications, and ensure that only wealthy families can afford proper winter protection. Or you can trust the community to build responsibly using specifications that have proven themselves through actual use. The first option protects Mr. Blackwell's business model. The second option protects people's lives. Council President Mitchell cleared his throat. Are there others who wish to speak? John Whitmore stood. My sons and I have built 6 tunnel systems using Mrs. Vance's manual. Every one of them has performed exactly as specified. The families using them report feeling safer and more confident about winter preparation than they ever have before. I can't speak to theoretical engineering, but I can speak to practical results. The results are good. Saracen stood next. My tunnel kept me from losing more toes to frostbite, kept my boarders fed through storms that would have made cooking impossible. I followed the manual exactly. It worked perfectly. I don't need expensive engineers telling me I should have paid more for something that works just fine. One by one, others stood. Families who had built tunnels. Workers who had helped with construction. People who had survived January's brutal cold without incident because they had underground protection. The testimony was consistent. Thomas's designs worked, Margaret's teaching was sound, and professional regulation would serve commercial interests rather than public safety. Caldwell tried to interject, citing professional standards and liability concerns, but his voice was drowned out by the accumulating weight of actual experience. Theory couldn't compete with results. Formulas couldn't argue with survival. Finally, Council President Mitchell raised his hand for silence. I've heard enough. The council will deliberate and announce our decision. The 5 council members huddle at the front of the room, their discussion too quiet for the audience to hear. Margaret returned to her seat beside Alice. Suddenly exhausted, she had defended Thomas's work, defended her teaching, defended the principle that knowledge should be accessible rather than proprietary. But she had no idea if it had been enough. Alice squeezed her hand. You did well. We'll see. The deliberation lasted 15 minutes. When the council members returned to their seats, Mitchell's expression was carefully neutral. The council has decided that tunnel construction will remain unregulated. Property owners may build according to whatever specifications they choose, including those provided in Mrs. Vance's manual. We find no evidence of safety concerns that would justify restricting access to construction knowledge that has proven effective in actual use. Relief washed through Margaret so strongly she felt dizzy. Alice was grinning. John Whitmore and his sons were clapping. The crowd erupted in conversation. Some people celebrating, others protesting the decision. Murphy stood abruptly. This is a mistake. When someone dies because they trusted amateur advice, then we'll address it at that time, Mitchell interrupted. Until then, people are free to make their own choices about winter preparation. Meeting adjourned. The crowd dispersed slowly. Some people approached Margaret to offer congratulations or ask questions about upcoming projects. Others left quickly, uncomfortable with the confrontation they had witnessed or disappointed with the outcome. Harrison Blackwell and Ernest Caldwell departed without speaking to anyone, their professional expertise rejected in favor of practical experience. Murphy lingered near the door, glaring at Margaret with undisguised hostility, but he said nothing before finally leaving. John Whitmore approached as the room emptied. That was well done, Margaret. You stood up to professional intimidation and won. I stood up for Thomas's work. The council made the right decision. They made the decision that benefits the community rather than commercial interests. That's rare enough to celebrate. Whitmore extended his hand. My offer stands. If you need help with any projects this summer, my sons and I are available. Margaret shook his hand. I'll remember that. Thank you. Sarah Chun was the last to leave. She waited until the room was empty, except for Margaret and Alice, before speaking. You made enemies tonight. Murphy won't forgive being proven wrong publicly. Blackwell lost business. He was counting on. They'll find ways to make trouble. I know. But you also made allies. People who will remember that you chose to share knowledge rather than hoard it. That matters more than you think. Sarah smiled. The Chinese have a saying, the tree that grows tallest faces the strongest wind. You're growing tall, Margaret. The wind is coming. But you've shown tonight that you can stand against it. After Sarah left, Margaret and Alice walked home through the summer evening. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The wind that had been blowing all day had finally died to a whisper. Do you think they'll keep making trouble? Alice asked. Probably. Men like Murphy don't change their minds just because the council rules against them. But we won what matters. The tunnels can continue. The knowledge can spread. Next winter, more families will have protection than would have if we'd lost a night. Father would be proud. Father would be relieved. He spent his life worrying about the next winter. Now we've done something about it. They reached home as full darkness fell. Margaret lit the lamps and started preparing their evening meal while Alice fetched water from the well. Through the kitchen window, she could see the dark opening of the tunnel entrance in the root cellar floor, the passage that had started everything, the first proof that Thomas's ideas could become functional reality. 43 families now had similar passages. By next winter, there might be 100. The knowledge was spreading, growing, becoming something larger than Margaret or Thomas or any individual contribution. That was enough. It had to be enough. Section 8. The victory resolution achieved. Summer brought construction at a pace Margaret had never imagined possible. The council's decision had removed the last barrier to widespread tunnel adoption. Families who had been hesitating, worried about regulations or liability, now moved forward with confidence. By August, 63 tunnel systems were complete or under construction in Copper Ridge and the surrounding homesteads. Margaret's manual had sold 127 copies, spreading knowledge throughout the territory. Letters arrived from as far away as Wyoming and the Dakotas, requesting information about winter protection systems that could save lives and livestock. Margaret responded to every letter personally, sending copies of the manual and offering consultation by mail for anyone who needed help adapting Thomas's designs to their specific circumstances. She charged nothing for the advice. Some people sent money anyway, donations to support the work, which she used to print more manuals and occasionally to help families who couldn't afford construction materials. The bakery continued to provide their primary income, but the tunnel work had become something more significant than a business. It had become a movement, a community-wide commitment to preparation over wishful thinking, to shared knowledge over proprietary expertise. Not everyone participated. Murphy and his allies continued to resist, insisting that proper frontier men didn't need elaborate winter protection. A few families followed Blackwell's company, paying premium prices for professionally engineered tunnels that weren't appreciably better than those built from Margaret's manual. But the majority chose Thomas's proven designs. They built carefully, following specifications that had demonstrated reliability through actual use. They helped each other, sharing labor and expertise in the cooperative tradition that had always sustained frontier communities when commercial interests didn't interfere. In September, as the aspen leaves turned gold and the first frost whitened the morning grass, Margaret stood in her bakery and counted her accomplishments. 3 personal tunnels connecting every building on her property. 63 community tunnel systems built or building. Over 100 manuals distributed. Dozens of people trained in construction techniques that could save their lives. Most importantly, 0 failures, 0 injuries, 0 deaths among people who had used the tunnels during the brief cold snaps that had tested them through late spring and early fall. The real test would come in winter. Margaret knew that. Everyone knew that. The question wasn't whether the tunnels worked in theory. Practical experience had already answered that. The question was whether they would work at scale, whether a community-wide adoption of underground protection would prove as reliable as a handful of early examples. October brought the first serious snow, 6 inches overnight, accompanied by temperatures that dropped to 15 below. Margaret made her morning trip to the bakery through the tunnel, starting her ovens and mixing her dough in warmth and safety while the wind howled above ground. Her customers arrived bundled against the cold, stamping snow from their boots and gratefully accepting hot bread and warmer surroundings. They talked about the storm, about how the tunnels had performed, about neighbors who had struggled through drifted snow, while those with underground passages had moved about their properties without difficulty. The stories were universally positive. The tunnels worked. All of them, across the entire community, without exception. The specifications Thomas had developed held true when implemented by amateur builders following written instructions. Professional engineering hadn't been necessary. Expensive consultations hadn't been required. Ordinary people, given good information and clear instructions, had built protection that functioned exactly as intended. By November, even some of the skeptics were reconsidering. 2 families who had refused to build tunnels the previous spring now approached Margaret about starting projects before the ground froze completely. She helped them, sending John Whitmore's sons to assist with the digging and providing consultation on the drainage and support structure details that determined success or failure. Murphy didn't approach her. He spent the autumn at a saloon, drinking more heavily than usual, complaining to anyone who would listen about how the town had lost its frontier spirit and everyone was getting soft. People mostly ignored him. A few pointed out that Samuel Peterson had possessed plenty of frontier spirit, and it hadn't kept him alive. Harrison Blackwell's construction firm left Copper Ridge entirely. Without regulatory requirements to justify premium pricing, they couldn't compete with free manuals and community cooperation. They moved their operation to a different territory, presumably to try the same commercial approach somewhere the community hadn't already organized around accessible knowledge. December arrived with cold that felt familiar now rather than threatening. Margaret maintained her daily routine, moving between buildings through passages that held steady temperature regardless of surface conditions. She baked her bread, fed her livestock, managed her supplies, and taught occasional consultation sessions for people preparing to build their own tunnels the following spring. Alice turned 17 that month. Margaret baked a special cake, one of the elaborate fairs that took hours of work and required ingredients they normally couldn't justify. They ate it together in the kitchen while snow fell outside, talking about the future in ways they hadn't since Thomas died. "I've been thinking about next year," Alice said, picking at the cake crumbs on her plate. "About what I want to do. You'll keep helping with the bakery." Margaret had assumed this without really thinking about it. The bakery was their livelihood. Alice's help was essential to managing the workload. "I could, but I've also been thinking about the tunnel work, about what you've been teaching people." Alice looked up, her expression serious. "I'm good at the technical drawings, good at explaining the specifications. People listen when I teach them." Margaret felt surprise, followed immediately by recognition. Of course Alice was good at teaching. She had Thomas's methodical approach to problems, Margaret's patience with people, and a natural aptitude for translating complex technical concepts into language anyone could understand. "You want to focus on the tunnel work instead of the bakery? I want to help it grow. You've proven the concept here in Copper Ridge, but there are dozens of other towns, hundreds of homesteads, thousands of families who don't have access to the information. Someone needs to travel, teach, help them build their own protection. I could do that." Margaret's first instinct was to refuse. Alice was 17, too young to be traveling alone through Montana territory, too inexperienced to handle the complications that would inevitably arise. But then she remembered being 17 herself, newly married to Thomas, helping him build their first cabin while neighbors predicted certain failure. Youth wasn't the same as incapability. "It would be difficult," Margaret said carefully. "Traveling in winter is dangerous. Some places won't welcome a young woman telling them how to build. You'd face resistance, skepticism, probably worse. I'd face the same things you faced. You managed. I was older, established, a widow with a business, which gave me certain protections. Mother," Alice reached across the table and took Margaret's hand. "Father spent 15 years learning these principles. You spent a year implementing them and teaching others. Now it's my turn to carry it forward. This knowledge is too important to stay in one place. You know that. Father would have known that." She was right. Thomas would have wanted the knowledge to spread as far as possible, to help as many people as possible, regardless of who did the teaching. His journals had never been about personal glory. They had been about practical survival, about understanding what worked and sharing that understanding so others didn't have to learn through fatal mistakes. "All right," Margaret said, "but we do it properly. We create a proper training program. We document everything so you have written materials to support your teaching. We establish connections with people in other territories who can provide support if you run into trouble. And you take someone with you." John Whitmore's younger son, Robert, has been asking about working with the tunnel projects full-time. He could serve as assistant and security both. Alice smiled. "That sounds perfect." They spent the rest of December planning. Margaret compiled an expanded version of the manual, including troubleshooting sections and detailed case studies from Copper Ridge's tunnel construction experience. Alice practiced her teaching approach, conducting workshops for families planning spring construction projects. Robert Whitmore signed on enthusiastically, bringing carpentry skills and frontier experience that would make Alice's travels safer and more effective. By January, when the coldest weather arrived, they were ready. Not to leave immediately. Travel would wait for spring, but ready in the sense that the next phase was planned and prepared for, ready to launch when conditions allowed. The cold that came in mid-January was brutal, but not surprising. Temperatures dropped to 40 below and stayed there for 5 days. The wind came down from Canada with the relentless force that had characterized every Montana winter Margaret had experienced. But this time, she wasn't afraid. The tunnel system functioned perfectly, maintaining above freezing temperature while surface conditions would have killed anyone exposed for more than minutes. She moved between buildings as easily as if it were spring, accomplishing her daily work without ever confronting the deadly cold above. The same was true throughout Copper Ridge. 63 families with tunnel systems went about their winter routines with minimal disruption. Livestock were fed and watered on schedule. Supplies remained accessible. No one died trying to reach their barn or storage shed or any other building that proper preparation had connected underground. The contrast with previous winters was stark. Margaret remembered January 3 years ago, when Thomas's death was still fresh and she had nearly lost fingers trying to reach the bakery. She remembered January 2 years ago, when Samuel Peterson had died 40 feet from safety. She remembered last January, when she had been digging the first tunnel and wondering if anyone would ever believe it was worth the effort. Now, standing in her warm bakery while wind screamed outside and temperatures sat 40 below, she knew the answer. It had been worth every shovelful of earth, every hour of labor, every moment of doubt and exhaustion. The tunnels had transformed winter from a season of survival anxiety to something manageable, even routine. In February, as the days began lengthening and the worst cold retreated, the regional newspaper sent a reporter to Copper Ridge. He spent 3 days interviewing families about their tunnel systems, examining construction details, and documenting the community's winter experience. The article ran the first week of March under the headline, "Montana Town Defeats Winter Through Underground Engineering." It described Thomas's original designs, Margaret's implementation and teaching, and a community-wide adoption that had made Copper Ridge the safest winter settlement in the territory. The article concluded with a quote from Margaret that the reporter had captured during their final interview. "My husband understood that the frontier values toughness, but toughness alone isn't enough. Real strength comes from preparation, from building systems that work even when conditions exceed human endurance, from sharing knowledge so everyone has access to protection that saves lives. That's not weakness. That's wisdom." The article was reprinted in newspapers throughout the territory. Requests for construction manual increased dramatically. Letters arrived from town councils, military posts, mining operations, and individual homesteaders, all wanting information about winter protection systems that had proven themselves through actual use. Margaret and Alice responded to every letter. They sent manuals, offered consultation, and scheduled teaching visits for the upcoming construction season. The work was growing beyond anything Margaret had imagined possible, becoming a legacy that would outlive her and touch lives she would never meet. In late March, as snow began melting and construction season approached, Margaret received an unexpected visitor. Ernest Caldwell, the engineer who had testified against Emmanuel at the town council meeting, appeared at the bakery during the afternoon lull. He looked uncomfortable, standing at the counter with his hat in his hands. "Mrs. Vance, I owe you an apology." Margaret set down the rag she'd been using to clean the counter. "Go on." "I was hired by Blackwell's firm to provide technical credibility for their commercial interests. I reviewed your manual looking for problems to cite rather than evaluating it honestly. That was unprofessional and wrong." He pulled a folded document from his coat pocket. "I've written a formal assessment of your specifications based on actual performance data from this winter. My conclusion is that your manual provides sound, conservative design principles appropriate for frontier construction by non-professional builders. I'd like your permission to publish this assessment in the Territorial Engineering Journal." Margaret took the document and skimmed it. The language was technical, but the meaning was clear. Professional endorsement of Thomas's designs based on empirical evidence rather than theoretical objections. "Why?" she asked. "Why admit you were wrong now?" "Because I was wrong. Because people's lives depend on good information. Because advancing my career by undermining reliable safety measures is the kind of professional misconduct that I can't live with." Caldwell met her gaze directly. "I'm not asking forgiveness. I'm asking permission to help correct the damage I caused." Margaret considered. Caldwell had been a paid opponent, using his credentials to attack work he hadn't properly evaluated. But he was also offering something valuable, professional validation that would help the knowledge spread further and overcome skepticism in communities where expert opinion carried weight. "You can publish your assessment," she said, "on one condition. You include Thomas's name as the originating engineer. These designs were his work. He spent 15 years developing them. He deserved the credit." "Of course. That's only proper." After Caldwell left, Alice emerged from the back room where she'd been preparing tomorrow's dough. That was unexpected. People surprise you sometimes, usually in disappointing ways. occasionally in good ones. Margaret returned to cleaning the counter. His assessment will help. Not everyone trusts frontier wisdom. Some people need professional validation before they'll accept that something works. Even when practical results are obvious, especially then, results threaten people's assumptions. Professional opinions give them permission to change their minds without admitting they were wrong initially. The engineering journal published Caldwell's assessment in April. The validation from a credentialed professional had exactly the effect Margaret had predicted. Widespread acceptance among people who had been skeptical of a manual written by a baker following her minor husband's journals. The combination of practical results plus professional endorsement removed the last significant barrier to adoption. By May, when construction season fully arrived, Margaret had requests for teaching visits from 43 different communities throughout Montana Territory and neighboring regions. She couldn't possibly meet all of them personally, but Alice could take half. Robert Whitmore could assist with technical details. An expanded manual provided written guidance for communities that managed construction independently. The knowledge was spreading, not under Margaret's control, not requiring her constant supervision, but growing organically as people recognized the value and shared it with neighbors, relatives, and anyone else who faced similar winter challenges. That was exactly what Thomas would have wanted. Not a commercial empire, not personal glory, but practical knowledge freely shared and widely implemented, saving lives through simple preparation and sound engineering. Section 9. The New Life, Epilogue and Future. September 1887. 1 year after the town council meeting. Margaret stood at the entrance to her root cellar tunnel, watching Alice and Robert Whitmore load supplies into their wagon for a teaching tour that would take them through 6 communities over the next 2 months. The wagon was packed with manuals, construction tools, sample materials, and camping equipment for nights when they wouldn't reach a town before dark. Alice looked competent and confident in a way that reminded Margaret of Thomas. Focused, prepared, ready to handle whatever challenges arose. Robert looked equally capable, his carpenter's tools organized with the precision of someone who understood that good work required good preparation. "You have everything?" Margaret asked, knowing the question was unnecessary, but unable to resist the motherly impulse. "Everything." Alice hugged her. "We'll be fine, Mother. We've practiced the presentations. We have letters of introduction from families who built successfully. Robert knows how to handle trouble if it arises. Write when you can. Let me know how the teaching goes." "I will, and you take care of the bakery. Don't work yourself to exhaustion trying to handle all the consultation requests alone." Margaret smiled. "I have help now. Sarah Chen's niece is learning the baking. John Whitmore handles most of the technical questions. I'm learning to delegate." They departed in the early morning light, the wagon wheels creaking as they rolled down the main street and toward the mountain road that would take them to their first destination. Margaret watched until they disappeared around a bend, then returned to her bakery to start the day's work. The bakery was busier than ever, not because bread was more popular, but because the bakery had become an informal headquarters for tunnel-related questions and consultation. People stopped by to report on their construction progress, to ask about drainage problems or support structure details, to share innovations they had discovered while adapting Thomas's basic designs to their specific circumstances. Margaret answered questions, offered advice, and listened to the accumulating stories of success. 78 tunnel systems now connected buildings throughout Copper Ridge and the surrounding homesteads. 0 failures, 0 injuries, 0 deaths during the previous winter's worst cold. The practical proof had become overwhelming. Underground protection worked, and worked reliably when built according to sound specifications. In October, the territorial governor visited Copper Ridge as part of a tour of frontier settlements. He asked specifically to see Margaret's tunnel system and to discuss winter safety measures that had attracted attention throughout the region. Margaret showed him the passages, explained Thomas's engineering principles, and answered his questions with the confidence of someone who had transformed theory into proven practice. The governor was impressed enough to propose a territorial winter safety initiative, offering modest funding for communities that wanted to implement underground protection systems before the next winter arrived. The funding wasn't generous, but it was enough to make materials more accessible for families who couldn't afford lumber at market prices. Margaret helped design the distribution program, ensuring that resources went to homesteads that needed them most rather than being captured by commercial interests. By November, winter preparations felt routine rather than urgent. The community had internalized the lessons Thomas had documented, understanding that safety came from preparation rather than toughness, from engineered systems rather than wishful thinking. The first serious cold snap brought temperatures to 30 below, and life continued without disruption. Margaret made her daily trips through the tunnels, baked her bread, managed her business, and felt something she hadn't experienced since Thomas died: security. Not the security of certainty, because the frontier never offered that, but the security of knowing she had built something that would endure, that would protect her and others regardless of what weather or circumstance brought. Alice's letters arrived regularly, reporting success in the communities she visited. Most people were receptive to the teaching. A few were skeptical until they saw practical demonstrations. Some had already started building independently from copies of the manual. The knowledge was spreading exactly as it should, organically, growing from demonstrated value rather than imposed authority. In December, Margaret received a letter that surprised her. It came from a mining operation in the Northern Territories, written by a superintendent who had read about Copper Ridge's tunnel systems and wanted to implement similar protection for his workers. Mining camps faced different challenges than homesteads: larger populations, more complex building layouts, higher stakes for failure. But the fundamental principles remained the same. Margaret wrote a detailed response, adapting Thomas's specifications for mining camp applications, and offered to conduct a site visit the following spring to help with implementation planning. The superintendent accepted immediately, offering payment that was more than fair for the consultation. The work was growing beyond individual homesteads, beyond single towns, becoming something larger, not a business. Margaret still refused to build a commercial enterprise around Thomas's knowledge, but movement toward better winter preparedness that could save hundreds or thousands of lives across the Northern Territories. January 1888 brought the coldest weather since the storm that had killed Samuel Peterson. Temperatures dropped to 58 below zero, staying there for 6 consecutive days. The wind came down from Canada with force that rattled buildings and piled snow in drifts that buried ground floor windows. It was the kind of cold that tested everything, that found weaknesses in preparation and exploited them without mercy, that separated adequate from excellent, good enough from truly reliable. The tunnels held perfectly. Every system in Copper Ridge maintained above freezing temperature throughout the extreme cold. People moved between buildings without difficulty, maintained their livestock care routines, kept their businesses operating. Life continued not just surviving, but actually functioning during weather that would have paralyzed the community just 2 years earlier. The town emerged from the cold snap without casualties. No frostbite injuries. No livestock losses due to exposure. No deaths from people attempting to reach buildings in weather that exceeded human endurance. The contrast of previous winters was absolute. Proof that preparation made the difference between death and survival, between crisis and merely difficult circumstances. In February, Margaret received a letter from the Territorial Engineering Society. They were establishing an award for a practical engineering achievement by non-professional innovators. Thomas Vance would be the first recipient, honored posthumously for developing winter protection systems that had saved lives throughout the region. Margaret was invited to accept the award on his behalf at a ceremony in the territorial capital. She went, traveling by stage with Alice, who had returned from her teaching tour just in time to accompany her mother. The ceremony was formal and somewhat uncomfortable. Margaret had never been comfortable with official recognition, but she accepted the award with simple dignity. "My husband would have been pleased," she said when asked to speak, not because of awards or recognition, but because the knowledge he accumulated is being used, because people are building protection that works, because fewer families face winter with only courage and hope. Those were never enough. Thomas understood that. Now more people do. That's the real achievement. The award was bronze, mounted on a wooden base, inscribed with Thomas's name and the dates of his life. Margaret brought it home and placed it on the shelf above the fireplace, where she could see it every day. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder of what one person's careful observation and documentation could accomplish if others were willing to learn and implement. Spring came with the usual rush of construction activity. More tunnel systems being built, more families preparing for the next winter, more communities reaching out for teaching and consultation. The work continued, growing steadily, becoming part of how people thought about winter preparation rather than an unusual innovation. Alice planned another teaching tour, this time extending into Wyoming and the Dakotas, where cold was equally brutal and winter protection equally necessary. Robert Whitmore would accompany her again, and this time they would be joined by Sarah Chen's nephew, a young man who had learned construction techniques while helping his aunt build her dining room connection. Margaret watched them prepare with pride and a lingering trace of anxiety. She had spent her life preparing, building, protecting. Watching her daughter venture into uncertain territory brought back all the fears she had experienced when Thomas died and left her to manage alone. But Alice wasn't alone. She had Robert and Sarah's nephew. She had comprehensive written materials. She had letters of introduction and a growing network of people who had benefited from the teaching and would help if problems arose. Most importantly, she had confidence born from demonstrated success, the knowledge that what she was teaching worked, that it saved lives, that it mattered. The teaching tours departed in April. Margaret returned to her bakery and her consultation work, managing the steady flow of questions and requests that arrived by mail. She was 52 now, her hands still strong, but increasingly marked by the years of labor. Her back ached most mornings. She moved more slowly than she once had, but she was content in ways she had never been before Thomas died. The tunnels had given her more than physical protection. They had given her purpose beyond daily survival, connection to a community that had learned to trust her judgment, and the satisfaction of knowing that Thomas's work would outlive them both. In June, she stood at the entrance to the tunnel system one evening after the bakery closed, looking at the passage that had started everything. The support posts were weathered but solid. The roof board showed no signs of stress. The drainage system functioned exactly as designed. The passage was approaching its second birthday and showed no degradation that might threaten its long-term reliability. Thomas had built for permanence. The tunnels would last decades, maybe longer, protecting whoever lived here long after Margaret was gone. That felt right. Good work endured. Good knowledge spread. Good preparation saved lives regardless of who originally did the preparing. She closed the trapdoor and walked upstairs to her kitchen. Through the window, she could see the mountains rising against the evening sky, their peaks still white with snow that wouldn't melt until July. The frontier was beautiful and brutal, offering both promise and danger to anyone willing to face it. Margaret had learned to face it, not with toughness alone, not with stubborn determination, but with preparation and engineering and shared knowledge that turned individual survival into community resilience. That was Thomas's legacy. That was what the tunnels represented. That was what she would continue building, teaching, and defending for however many years remained. The work wasn't finished. It would never be finished. Every winter brought new challenges. Every community needed teaching. Every generation would have to learn the lessons Thomas had documented and Margaret had implemented. But the foundation was solid. The knowledge was spreading. And when the next killing cold arrived, when the wind came screaming down from Canada and temperatures dropped beyond human endurance, people would descend into passages carved from earth and timber and survive what would once have killed them. That was enough. That had always been enough. December 1892, 5 years after the town council meeting. Margaret Vance was 57 years old when the winter came that everyone would remember, not because it was the coldest, though temperatures reached 63 below zero, the lowest ever recorded in Montana Territory. Not because it lasted the longest, those storms continued from November through March with barely a week's respite between them, but because it tested every tunnel system, every specification, every principle that Thomas had documented and Margaret had taught across 5 years of construction and consultation. The winter that proved whether the knowledge would endure. It began quietly enough. October brought early snow that melted by noon. November delivered cold snaps that reached 20 below, but never lingered more than a few days. December arrived with gray skies and steady wind. Nothing extraordinary, nothing that suggested what was building to the north. Margaret noticed the animals first. The chickens stopped ranging beyond their shelter, even during midday warmth. The milk cow became restless, pacing the barn with nervous energy that had no obvious cause. Even Rusty, the old dog who had replaced Colt 3 years ago when age finally claimed him, spent more time pressed against the kitchen stove than usual. "Something's coming," Margaret said to Alice, who had returned home for the winter after 3 years of teaching tours throughout the territories. Her daughter was 22 now, confident and capable, with a reputation as the best tunnel construction instructor in the region. But she still came home for the hardest months, and Margaret was grateful for the company. "Weather always comes," Alice replied, kneading dough at the bakery's main work table. "That's Montana. This is different. The animals know." Alice looked up at her mother's tone. Margaret didn't make predictions lightly. 5 years of winter observation, combined with everything Thomas had taught her, had given her an instinct for weather that proved reliable more often than not. How different. Bad different. The kind that tests everything we built. The storm arrived on December 8th, announced by a sky that turned the color of old iron and wind that shifted from steady to violent in the space of an hour. The temperature, which had been holding at 15 above, dropped 20 degrees before sunset. By midnight, it had dropped another 20. Margaret made her evening trip through the tunnels, checking livestock and securing supplies, and noticed something she'd never experienced before. The tunnel air, which normally held steady around 30 degrees regardless of surface conditions, was cooling, not dramatically. It had dropped perhaps 5 degrees, but enough to be noticeable, enough to be concerning. The earth itself was losing its ability to buffer the cold. Whatever was happening above ground was so extreme that it was penetrating deeper than standard winter weather could reach. By morning, the thermometer outside Margaret's kitchen window read 47 below zero. The wind was screaming across the plateau with force that made the house timbers groan. Snow wasn't falling so much as being ripped horizontally across the landscape, scouring everything in its path. Margaret descended into the tunnel system with extra caution, carrying her lantern and a heavy coat despite the underground passage. The air temperature had dropped to 23 degrees, cold enough that she could see her breath, cold enough that she needed the coat after all. The tunnel structure held perfectly. The support posts showed no stress. The roof boards remained solid. The drainage system was handling the moisture from her breath and the small amount of condensation that was forming on the walls. Everything Thomas had designed, everything Margaret had built, was functioning exactly as specified, but it was colder than it had ever been. The Earth's protection, while still considerable, wasn't providing the complete insulation that had characterized previous winters. This cold was different, deeper, more penetrating. She reached a livestock shelter and found the animals huddled together, sharing warmth in the instinctive way that creatures use when their survival depended on it. She fed and watered them, spoke calming words, and tried not to let her concern show. Animals sense fear. Right now, they needed confidence, not anxiety. The return trip through the tunnels took longer than usual. Margaret found herself moving carefully, checking structural details with more attention than routine required. Everything held, everything functioned, but the cold was testing the system in ways that previous winters hadn't, and she needed to understand how it was performing under extreme conditions. Back in her kitchen, Alice was waiting with hot coffee. "How bad is it?" "The tunnels are holding, but the cold is deeper than anything we planned for." Thomas's specifications assumed earth insulation would maintain temperature above freezing regardless of surface conditions. We're getting close to that threshold. Close to freezing underground? Close to testing whether the tunnels can function if temperatures drop below freezing inside the passages. Ice formation could block drainage. Frost heave could stress the support structure. We might be facing conditions that exceed the design parameters. Alice set down her coffee cup with careful precision. How many tunnel systems are there now? In Copper Ridge? 93. Throughout the territories? Probably close to 500. All of them built to Thomas's specifications. all of them depending on those specifications to remain valid under extreme conditions. And if they don't, Margaret didn't answer immediately. The question hung between them like smoke. 500 tunnel systems. Perhaps 3,000 people depending on underground protection to survive the winter. If the specifications failed, if something fundamental had been overlooked or miscalculated, if the cold exceeded what Thomas's 15 years of observation had prepared them for, the consequences would be catastrophic. Then we learn, Margaret finally said, and we document what we learn so the next generation knows better. The cold intensified over the following week. 50 below, 55 below, 60 below. Numbers that stopped having meaning, except as measurements of something that existed beyond human scale, beyond human endurance, beyond anything the frontier had prepared people to face. The tunnel air temperature stabilized at 18 degrees, cold enough that Margaret wore heavy coats for every trip, cold enough that frost formed on the walls in thin, delicate patterns. But above freezing, still above freezing, the structure continued to hold. The support posts, spaced at Thomas's specified 6-foot intervals, distributed the load evenly. The roof boards, 3 inches thick and overlapped according to precise instructions, carried the weight of earth and accumulated snow without sagging. The drainage system, sloped at 1 inch per 6 feet of length, continued to move moisture toward the gravel sumps where it could freeze harmlessly rather than blocking the passages. Everything worked, under conditions that exceeded anything Thomas had witnessed during his 15 years of observation, under cold that was testing the absolute limits of the design. Everything worked. Margaret made detailed notes in Thomas's old journal, documenting temperatures and structural performance with the same careful precision he had used. This wasn't just survival, this was data collection, evidence that would help future builders understand the true limits of what underground protection could achieve. Other people in Copper Ridge were doing the same thing. John Whitmore's tunnel system, which connected 4 buildings across a larger property than Margaret's, was performing identically. Sarah Chen's passage between kitchen and dining room reported the same temperature drops and the same structural stability. The systems built by families Margaret had personally trained, and those built from the manual by people she'd never met, all showed consistent performance under extreme conditions. The knowledge was holding. The specifications were valid. Thomas's empirical observations, accumulated over 15 years and refined through 5 years of community implementation, were proving themselves against weather that pushed beyond the boundaries of normal experience. On December 18th, 10 days into the extreme cold, Margaret received an unexpected visitor. A young man appeared at her door, so bundled against the weather that she didn't recognize him until he unwrapped his face coverings in the warmth of her kitchen. Robert Whitmore, looking exhausted and half-frozen despite proper winter clothing. Robert, what are you doing traveling in this weather? Margaret pulled him toward the stove. Where's Alice? Is she safe? Alice is fine. She's in Helena with my family. We made it there before the worst cold arrived. Robert accepted the coffee Alice brought him, wrapping his hands around the cup for warmth. I came back to check on my father and brothers, and to tell you something important. What? The tunnel systems are holding everywhere, not just here in Copper Ridge. Everywhere we taught construction over the past 3 years. Helena, Billings, Bozeman, every settlement and homestead where people build according to the manual. The cold is testing everything, and everything is holding. Margaret felt something release in her chest that she hadn't realized she was holding tight. No failures. None. 0 structural collapses. 0 drainage system failures. 0 casualties among people using the tunnels for winter protection. Robert set down his coffee and pulled a folded newspaper from inside his coat. The territorial newspaper ran this yesterday. You should read it. The article was headlined, Underground Engineering Saves Hundreds During Record Cold. It documented the extreme weather, the unprecedented temperatures, and a remarkable fact that communities with tunnel systems were experiencing minimal disruption while those without were facing crisis conditions. 17 deaths were attributed to the cold snap across the territories. All 17 were people who had tried to move between buildings during the worst weather without underground protection. 0 deaths had occurred among the estimated 3,000 people who had access to tunnel systems built according to Thomas Vance's specifications. The contrast was absolute. The vindication was complete. Margaret read the article twice, then handed it to Alice. Her daughter's expression showed relief mixed with something deeper, recognition that what they had built over 5 years of difficult work, what they had defended against skepticism and commercial opposition, what they had taught to hundreds of families across the territories, had proven itself under the most extreme test possible. Father would have been proud, Alice said quietly. Father would have been relieved, Margaret replied. He spent his life worrying about whether his observations were complete, whether his specifications would hold under conditions he hadn't personally witnessed. Now we know. They hold. Even when the weather exceeds anything he experienced, the principles remain sound. Robert stayed the night, sleeping on the floor near the kitchen stove because the cold made even a short trip to the Whitmore property dangerous despite their own tunnel system. He left the next morning when the temperature had climbed to a relatively mild 35 below, promising to return with more news when travel became safer. The extreme cold continued through the end of December and into January. Temperatures would climb to 20 below for a few days, enough to make people think the worst had passed, then plunge back to 50 or 60 below with storms that made previous winters seem gentle by comparison. The tunnel systems continued to perform. Margaret made her daily trips, maintained her business, cared for her livestock, and documented everything with meticulous attention to detail. She was no longer just using Thomas's specifications. She was validating them under the most rigorous test nature could provide. By February, when the weather finally began to moderate, Margaret had accumulated 40 pages of detailed observations about tunnel performance under extreme conditions. Temperature gradients at different depths, frost formation patterns on walls and support structures, drainage system behavior when air temperature approached freezing, structural stress indicators and how they differ from normal winter conditions. The data was invaluable, not because it revealed flaws in Thomas's designs, it didn't, but because it documented the true limits of what underground protection could achieve. Future builders would know with certainty that tunnels constructed to these specifications could handle anything Montana winter could deliver, including weather that exceeded historical extremes. Section 11, the recognition, community transformation. March brought warmer weather and something Margaret hadn't anticipated, pilgrims. That's what Alice called them when the first group arrived. 7 families from Wyoming Territory who had survived the winter without tunnel protection and decided they never wanted to experience that vulnerability again. They came to Copper Ridge specifically to see the tunnel systems, to learn construction techniques, to understand how a Montana settlement had weathered the worst winter in recorded history with 0 casualties, while their own communities had suffered significant losses. Margaret met with them in her bakery, spreading out Thomas's journals and her detailed winter documentation on tables usually reserved for bread cooling. She explained the engineering principles, the construction techniques, the maintenance requirements. She showed them her own tunnel system, let them walk the passages and examine the structural details, answered every question with the patience of someone who understood that knowledge saved lives only when it was properly shared. The Wyoming family stayed a week, learning and documenting, and preparing to return home with plans to build their own protection before the next winter arrived. Before they left, they asked Margaret to sign their copies of the construction manual, not as an autograph, but as a form of certification that they had received direct instruction from the source. More groups followed, families from the Dakotas, mining operations from the northern territories, military outposts that had lost soldiers to weather and wanted better protection for their personnel. Even a delegation from the Canadian settlements across the border, where winter was even more brutal and the need for engineering solutions even more urgent. Margaret taught them all, sometimes personally, sometimes with Alice's help, sometimes by directing them to students who had learned construction techniques and could teach as effectively as she could. The knowledge continued to spread, growing organically, reaching communities that might have taken decades to develop similar solutions independently. The territorial government took notice. In April, Margaret received an official letter from the governor's office requesting her presence at a ceremony honoring citizens who had made significant contributions to frontier safety and survival. She tried to decline. Official recognition had never interested her. But the letter came with train tickets for her and Alice, and a note explaining that Thomas would be posthumously awarded the Territorial Medal of Merit for engineering achievement. She went, not for herself, but for Thomas. The ceremony was held in the territorial capital, in a hall filled with government officials and military officers and citizens who had been invited to witness the recognition of extraordinary contributions to frontier development. Margaret sat in the front row with Alice beside her, uncomfortable in formal clothes she had borrowed for the occasion, waiting for her name to be called. When it came, she walked to front of the hall and accepted the medal on Thomas's behalf. The governor spoke about engineering achievement and practical innovation, and the importance of knowledge that served the common good rather than commercial interests. He cited statistics: 500 tunnel systems, 3,000 people protected, 0 casualties during the worst winter in recorded history. Then he asked Margaret to speak. She hadn't prepared remarks. She stood at the podium looking at the assembled officials and citizens and tried to find words that would honor Thomas without diminishing what others had contributed. "My husband was a miner," she began. "He spent his life underground, learning what made tunnels safe or dangerous, learning what the earth could provide for those who understood it properly. When we came to Montana Territory, he saw that people were dying from preventable exposure, dying because they built separate buildings without considering how to move between them safely during extreme weather." She paused, gathering her thoughts. He spent 15 years documenting solutions, measuring snow loads and wind patterns and frost depths, calculating support requirements and drainage angles, and roof structures that would hold under the worst conditions. He died before he could implement what he learned, but he left journals, detailed observations that I used to build the first tunnel system, that I shared with others, that became the manual that's now being used across the territories. Margaret looked directly at the governor. This medal honors Thomas. But the real achievement isn't one man's observations or one woman's teaching. It's what happens when knowledge is shared freely instead of hoarded commercially, when communities cooperate instead of compete, when people value survival over profit. That's what saved lives this winter. That's what will continue saving lives for generations after we're gone. The hall erupted in applause. Margaret returned to her seat, the medal heavy in her hands, and tried not to think about how uncomfortable Thomas would have been with the attention. He had valued useful work, not recognition for doing it. After the ceremony, people approached with congratulations and questions and requests for consultation on projects throughout the territories. Margaret answered what she could, directed inquiries to Alice for teaching visits, and tried to maintain the principle that had guided her from the beginning. Knowledge should be accessible to anyone who needed it, regardless of their ability to pay for expertise. One conversation stood out. An older woman, perhaps 70, with the weathered face of someone who had spent decades on the frontier, waited until the crowd had thinned before approaching. "Mrs. Vance, I want to thank you." "For what?" "My grandson built a tunnel system on his homestead, using your manual. Last December, during the worst cold, his wife went into labor. The midwife couldn't reach their cabin because of the weather, but he could reach the neighbor's place through his tunnel. The neighbor's wife had midwifing experience. She came back through the tunnel and delivered the baby safely. Mother and child both survived because they had protection that would have been impossible without your teaching." Margaret felt her throat tighten. "What did they name the baby?" "Thomas, after your husband. My grandson said he wanted his son to carry the name of the man whose knowledge had saved his family." Stories like that accumulated through the spring. Babies delivered during storms because midwives could travel through tunnels. Livestock saved because families could maintain care routines regardless of weather. Businesses that continued operating while competitors closed. Medical emergencies handled successfully because doctors could reach patients who would otherwise have been unreachable. The tunnels had accomplished more than winter protection. They had transformed how communities functioned during the hardest months, removing weather as a limiting factor on essential activities, enabling life to continue rather than merely survive. By May, when construction season arrived in full force, Margaret had more work than she could possibly manage. Teaching requests, consultation projects, speaking invitations from communities that wanted to hear directly from the woman who had pioneered practical winter engineering. She was 57 years old, tired in ways that went deeper than physical exhaustion, ready for someone else to carry the primary burden. Alice stepped forward naturally, the way she had been preparing to do for years. She took over the teaching tours, supervised major construction projects, handled the correspondence that arrived daily from across the territories. Margaret remained available for consultation on difficult technical questions, but increasingly she focused on what she did best, baking bread and documenting observations that would help future generations build even better protection. The transition felt right. Thomas had developed the knowledge. Margaret had implemented and taught it. Alice was spreading it further, reaching communities that might have taken decades to develop similar solutions independently. Each generation adding to what the previous had accomplished, building a legacy that would outlive them all. Section 12, the final chapter, looking forward. October 1895, 8 years after the town council meeting. Margaret Vance stood at the entrance to her tunnel system on a cool autumn morning, watching the sun rise over the mountains to the east. She was 60 years old now, her hair completely gray, her hands marked by decades of labor, her back requiring careful movement on cold mornings. But she was alive, healthy, secure in ways that would have seemed impossible when Thomas died 11 years ago. The bakery behind her was thriving, managed now primarily by Sarah Chen's niece, who had learned the trade and shown talent for both baking and business. Margaret still worked most mornings, but she no longer carried the full burden of production and sales. She had earned the right to slow down, to choose her work rather than being driven by survival necessity. The tunnel system that had started everything was still functioning perfectly. 8 years of continuous use, 8 brutal winters, countless trips through passages carved from earth and timber. The support post Thomas had specified showed no degradation. The roof boards remained solid. The drainage system continued to move moisture efficiently. Everything had been built to last, and everything was lasting exactly as designed. Throughout Copper Ridge, 93 tunnel systems provided winter protection for families who had learned to value preparation over toughness, engineering over endurance. Throughout the territories, the number approached 700, maybe more. Margaret had lost count as the knowledge spread beyond her ability to track every implementation. Alice was in the Dakotas now, leading a teaching tour that would last through the winter. She had married Robert Whitmore 2 years ago, a partnership that combined her technical expertise with his construction skills in ways that made them the most effective tunnel instruction team in the region. They were building something together that went beyond their individual contributions, exactly as Margaret and Thomas had done decades earlier. The thought brought both satisfaction and melancholy. Thomas had been gone 11 years now, long enough that the sharp grief had faded to dull ache, long enough that she could remember him without the overwhelming sense of loss that had characterized the early years. But she missed him still, missed him especially on mornings like this when she stood looking at work they had accomplished together even though he hadn't lived to see it completed. Footsteps on the frost-hardened grass announced a visitor. Margaret turned to find John Whitmore approaching, moving with the careful gait of someone whose knees no longer worked as smoothly as they once had. He was 65 now, mostly retired from active construction work, but still involved in tunnel consultation for complex projects. Morning, Margaret. John, you're up early. Couldn't sleep. Kept thinking about something I wanted to discuss with you. He joined her at the tunnel entrance, looking at the wooden trap door that had been opened and closed thousands of times over 8 years. The town council wants to establish a training center, official facility for teaching tunnel construction, winter safety, practical frontier engineering. They want to name it after Thomas. Margaret considered this. What would that involve? Building dedicated to instruction, workshop space for demonstrating techniques, reference library with construction manuals and documentation, maybe a few demonstration tunnels showing different approaches to common challenges. Whitmore pulled a folded paper from his coat. They've raised funds, enough to build properly and staff adequately. They want your permission to use Thomas's name and your involvement in designing the curriculum. She took the paper and scanned it. The proposal was thorough, well-planned, focused on practical education rather than empty commemoration. The kind of project Thomas would have supported. Useful work that served community needs rather than just honoring his memory. He would have liked this, Margaret said. Not the naming part, but the teaching center. He always believed knowledge was most valuable when it was systematically shared. So you'll participate? I'll design the curriculum. I'll provide Thomas's journal for the reference library. I'll teach the first classes, if you think that would help establish credibility. Margaret handed back the paper. But I want one condition. The training must remain accessible. No expensive tuition that only wealthy families can afford. If this is going to honor Thomas's work, it needs to honor his principles too. Knowledge that saves lives should be available to anyone who needs it. Already built into proposal. Sliding scale fees based on ability to pay. Scholarship for families who can't afford any payment. The goal is teaching, not profit. Then yes, let's build it. The Thomas Vance Winter Engineering Center opened the following spring. A sturdy log building constructed according to frontier standards with a demonstration tunnel running beneath it that showed proper support structure, drainage design, and roof construction. The reference library held not just Thomas's journals, but accumulated documentation from 8 years of tunnel construction throughout the territories. Case studies, technical observations, innovations that builders had discovered while adapting the basic specifications to their specific circumstances. Margaret taught the first classes personally, walking students through the engineering principles that Thomas had spent 15 years developing. She showed them how to calculate snow loads and frost depths, how to space support posts for optimal load distribution, how to design drainage systems that would function regardless of groundwater conditions, how to build structures that would last decades rather than just surviving a single winter. The students ranged from teenagers learning construction skills to experienced builders who wanted to understand the theory behind techniques they had been implementing practically. Some came from Copper Ridge, but most traveled from other communities throughout the territories, drawn by reputation and the understanding that this training offered knowledge that could save lives. Alice came home that summer, pregnant with her first child, and ready to settle in Copper Ridge for a while before returning to teaching tours. She joined Margaret at the training center, bringing fresh perspective and teaching techniques refined through 3 years of field instruction. Mother and daughter worked together, combining Margaret's deep knowledge with Alice's pedagogical innovations, creating a program that exceeded what either could have accomplished alone. In August, Alice gave birth to a son. She and Robert named him Thomas, continuing the tradition that the old woman at the territorial ceremony had started. Margaret held her grandson for the first time and felt the continuity of generations. Thomas's knowledge flowing forward through people who would never have known him personally, but who would benefit from what he had learned and documented. The baby was healthy, strong, born in a community that had learned to protect its vulnerable members rather than just expecting them to endure whatever hardship came. Born into a world that was incrementally safer because people had chosen to learn from experience rather than repeating the same survival struggles every generation. That was progress. Small, difficult, built from accumulated knowledge and community cooperation rather than dramatic innovation or individual genius. But progress nonetheless. Section 13. The Enduring Truth Final Reflection. December 1896, 9 years after the town council meeting. Winter had arrived early, bringing cold that reminded Margaret of the extreme weather that had tested the tunnel systems 3 years earlier. 20 below zero outside, 18 degrees in the tunnel passages, frost forming delicate patterns on the earthen walls. But inside Margaret's kitchen, warmth from the stove pushed back against the cold, creating an island of comfort in the hostile landscape. She sat at the table with Thomas's journal spread before her, adding new observations to documentation that now spanned nearly 3 decades. Temperature readings, structural performance notes, observations about how different soil types affected drainage and frost heave, the kind of detailed, practical information that future builders would need to adapt tunnel construction to circumstances Thomas and Margaret had never personally encountered. Outside, the wind screamed across the plateau with the relentless force that characterized Montana winters. But the sound had lost its power to frighten her. She knew the walls would hold, the tunnels would function, the livestock would survive because she could reach them regardless of weather. The fear that had dominated her life after Thomas died. The fear of winter, of exposure, of losing everything to conditions she couldn't control, had been replaced by confidence built from years of successful preparation. A knock at the door interrupted her documentation. She opened it to find a young woman standing on the porch, bundled against the cold, her face barely visible beneath scarves and hood. "Mrs. Vance? I'm Emma Harrison. I traveled from Wyoming to speak with you." Margaret pulled her inside, closed the door against the wind, and helped her remove the layers of winter clothing that made frontier travel possible in brutal cold. Underneath, Emma was perhaps 25, with the weathered face of someone who had spent years working outdoors and the determined expression of someone on a mission. "What brings you here in this weather?" "Your work. Your teaching." Emma accepted the coffee Margaret offered and wrapped her hands around the cup. "I grew up on a homestead in Wyoming. My father died during a winter storm when I was 12, frozen to death trying to reach our barn during a blizzard. He was 20 yards from the house. 20 yards. But the wind turned him around, and he never found his way back." Margaret had heard too many stories like this. Samuel Peterson, the families Alice had met during her teaching tours. Countless others whose deaths could have been prevented with proper preparation and underground protection. Each one a reminder that winter didn't care about courage or experience or determination. Winter cared about engineering and preparation, and whether you understood the mathematics of survival. "I'm sorry," Margaret said quietly. "After he died, my mother sold the homestead. We moved to town, lived in poverty, gave up everything he'd been trying to build. I swore I would never let that happen to my family. When I married, I made my husband promise we'd find a way to survive winter without risking exposure." Emma set down her coffee. "Last year, we built a tunnel system using your manual. House to barn, barn to storage shed. We survived last winter, without fear, without risk, without anyone having to choose between caring for livestock and staying safe. That's good. That's what the tunnels are supposed to do. I want to learn to teach others, to travel like your daughter does, helping families build protection before they lose someone the way we lost my father." Emma leaned forward, her intensity almost physical. "Will you train me? Teach me what I need to know to do this work properly." Someone who had lost too much and decided to channel grief into practical work that might spare others similar pain. The training center offers courses starting in spring. You should enroll. "I will, but I'm not talking about courses. I'm talking about apprenticeship, learning directly from you, the way your daughter did, understanding not just the technical specifications, but the principles behind them, the reasons Thomas made the choices he made, the way to adapt designs for circumstances that aren't covered in the manual. That's a significant commitment. It would take months, maybe a year. I know, but this work is too important to do halfway. If I'm going to teach people how to protect themselves, I need to understand it thoroughly. Will you accept me as a student?" Margaret looked at Thomas's journals on the table, at the documentation she had been adding, at the accumulated knowledge that represented 3 decades of observation and implementation. She was 61 years old. She wouldn't live forever. The knowledge needed to continue spreading after she was gone, needed to reach communities she would never visit personally, needed teachers who understood not just the how but the why. "Yes," she said. "Stay through the winter. Work with me. Learn the tunnels. Understand the engineering principles deeply enough to adapt them independently. In spring, when construction season begins, you can help with projects. By next fall, you'll be ready to teach on your own." Emma's face lit with gratitude and determination. "Thank you. You won't regret this." "I know I won't. Thomas's knowledge is too valuable to remain limited to the people I can reach personally. The more teachers we train, the more families we can help, the more lives we save. That's what matters." Over the following months, Emma proved herself an excellent student. She had natural aptitude for engineering principles, attention to detail that rivaled Margaret's own, and personal experience that gave her deep understanding of why the work mattered. She absorbed technical specifications quickly, but never stopped asking questions about the reasoning behind them, about how to evaluate new situations, about what to do when conditions didn't match the standard cases covered in the manual. By spring, she was helping teach classes at the training center. By summer, she was supervising construction projects with minimal oversight. By fall, she was ready to begin her own teaching tours, carrying Thomas's knowledge to communities that needed it but hadn't yet discovered it. Margaret watched her depart with the same mix of pride and melancholy she had felt when Alice began traveling. Another teacher spreading the knowledge. Another generation carrying forward what Thomas had started. The work continuing, growing, reaching beyond what any individual could accomplish alone. December 1897 arrived with cold that felt familiar now rather than threatening. Margaret was 62, increasingly content to let younger teachers carry the primary burden while she focused on documentation and complex consultation problems. The bakery was thriving under Sarah's niece's management. The training center was graduating its third class of students. Alice and Robert's son Thomas was 2 years old, healthy and curious, already showing interest in the building project his parents supervised. One evening, Margaret sat in her kitchen with Alice and young Thomas, watching her grandson play with wooden blocks while the wind howled outside. The contrast between the warmth inside and the killing cold beyond the walls felt like a metaphor for everything they had accomplished, creating islands of safety in a hostile environment, building protection that would endure long after the builders were gone. What happens next? Alice asked, watching her son build and rebuild a tower that kept collapsing. You've trained teachers. The training center is established. The knowledge is spreading. What's left to do? Margaret considered the question. Document what we've learned over 10 years of implementation. Write an advanced manual that covers edge cases and complex adaptations. Train enough teachers that the knowledge can reach every frontier settlement that needs it. Make sure the principles are understood deeply enough that they'll survive even if the original manuals are lost. That sounds like years of work. It is, but I'm not in a hurry. I have time. Margaret smiled at her daughter. And I have help. You and Robert, Emma Harrison, and the other teachers. Students who become teachers who train more students. This isn't work one person does. It's work a community does, across generations, building on what came before. Young Thomas knocked over his tower and laughed, delighted by destruction and the opportunity to build again. Margaret watched him and thought about continuity, about knowledge flowing forward through people who would never know Thomas Vance personally but would benefit from what he had learned. That was enough. That had always been enough. The tunnels would last decades, maybe longer. The knowledge would spread further still. Lives would be saved not just this winter, but next winter and the winter after that. For as long as people chose preparation over fatalism, engineering over endurance, shared knowledge over commercial control, Thomas would have been satisfied with that. Margaret was satisfied with it too. Outside, winter continued its relentless assault on the frontier. Inside, protected by earth and timber and accumulated wisdom, life continued. Bread was baked. Children played. Teachers prepared for spring construction season. Communities built protection that would serve them for generations. The cold knew. The cold always knew. And it took what people failed to protect. But people were learning. Slowly, painfully, at the cost of too many deaths and too much suffering, but learning nonetheless. Learning that toughness wasn't enough. Learning that preparation mattered more than courage. Learning that knowledge shared freely saved more lives than expertise hoarded commercially. That was Thomas's legacy. That was what Margaret had built from his journals. That was what would endure long after both of them are forgotten. The work continued. It would always continue. Every winter brought new challenges. Every generation needed teaching. But the foundation was solid, built from practical experience and proven results, strong enough to support whatever came next. Margaret closed Thomas's journal and stood, her back protesting the movement in the way that aging bodies did. She walked to a window and looked out at the frozen landscape. Somewhere out there, families were safe in their homes, connected to their livestock and supplies by passages they had built with their own hands. Somewhere out there, teachers were preparing to spread the knowledge further. Somewhere out there, the next generation was learning that survival didn't require sacrifice. It required understanding. She turned from a window and returned to her family, to Alice and young Thomas and the warmth of the kitchen stove, to the life she had built from grief and determination and knowledge that refused to be buried with the man who had discovered it. Tomorrow she would wake early and walk through the tunnels to start the bakery ovens. The day after that and the day after that, the same routine, the same protection, the same confidence that winter couldn't touch her in ways that mattered. The tunnels held. The knowledge spread. The work continued. That was enough. That had always been enough. And somewhere, in whatever place the dead resided, if they resided anywhere at all, Thomas Vance was satisfied.